Welcome back. Let's open this conversation with a quote. This is Toni Morrison writing in The Nation. I've linked to the full piece in the resource document. This is precisely the time when artists go to work. There is no time for despair, no place for self-pity, no need for silence, no room for fear. We speak, we write, we do language. That is how civilizations heal. I know the world is bruised and bleeding. And though it is important not to ignore its pain, it is also critical to refuse to succumb to its malevolence. Like failure, chaos contains information that can lead to knowledge, even wisdom, like art. That whole interview is really, really good. It was written in 2000, it's not even an interview, but the piece was written in 2004, reprinted again in 2015. And if you know anything about those years, you might know the ways in which that is also speaking directly to our moment, at least when I'm recording this in 2025 as well. It's also kind of the perfect food for thought to introduce this video. I want to do a deep dive into one of my favorite topics, the idea of the anthemic impulse, because anthemic writing is not the only way to meet the moment, which has kind of been the running theme of this series. But I do think it's a really useful tool, a really generative thing to think about. So first, just like a framing point, when I use the word anthem or anthemic, this is not a super specific dictionary definition poetic term. It's not like a sonnet or a sestina, like a specific kind of poem. I'm thinking more broadly about an impulse, a way of approaching an issue that can relate to any form, right? A slam poem, a sonnet, a rap song, a novel, a speech, an essay, a zine, any kind of communication can make use of this impulse. In my work and in this video, I most often talk about it in the context of political poetry, writing that explores or addresses some kind of issue. But what does it actually mean? Let's start with examples. I really like building a definition from examples rather than kind of giving you my definition and then looking at examples. So I'll share some poems here and I'll link to all these in the resource document. If you know them, they might help point in the direction of what we're talking about. If you don't know them, you can literally pause the video, go check them out, or, check them out later. But when I think of political poems that have anthemic elements, these are a few that come to mind for me. Once again, I'm going to start with the Suhair Hamad poem, and that's What I Will. I also think about The Body Is Not an Apology by Sonia Renee Taylor, Dinosaurs in the Hood by Denez Smith, The Low Road by Marge Piercy, The Heart and the Fist, also known as Rifle by Rudy Francisco, Good Bones by Maggie Smith, Accents by Denise Froman, Affirmation by Asada Shakur. I mean, there's a ton of Andrea Gibson poems that could fit here too. I think the one I'm going to highlight is Queer Youth Are 5 Times More Likely to Die by Suicide, because it highlights something that we're going to talk about later, the idea that the anthemic impulse isn't about running away from difficult or dark subject matter. It's about what we do with it, where we take it. And then, something that we talked about in the previous videos could fit here too. I think, Can We Please Give the Police Departments to the Grandmothers by Janata Petrus has an anthemic energy. I think Pocket Full of Warding Stones by Rasha Abdul Hadi has this energy. And honestly, you're watching this, you might know me, a lot of my own work, because this is something that I think about a lot, kind of goes in that direction. So poems like A Pragmatist Guide to Magic, or Tension and Release, or Hey There Medusa, or Matches. I could go on and on. But if you were to stop and go watch or read all these poems and then come back, I would ask you, what do you notice? What common threads or approaches stick out? And so as a first step into those kinds of questions, I made this 4-part Venn diagram. So the actual word anthem, right? If you've heard that word before, it's usually in the context of national anthems, songs that, whip people up into a nationalistic frenzy or spark nostalgia for the beauty of your country or whatever. And that's definitely not what I'm interested in. But if we really dig into both the traditional kind of notion of anthems and how we're using the term right here, there is some overlap. Looking at the diagram, we can see pride, right? The idea of we deserve respect, we celebrate ourselves. Political writing is so often assumed to be persuasive, convincing those people over there to agree with you. But anthemic writing isn't always about persuasion. It can be It can be, but like just as often, it's about affirmation, especially when the dominant culture doesn't affirm you, which then connects to the next point, which is defiance. The idea that this pride exists even or especially when the larger world tries to deny it. Like against all odds, we can and will win. We are the underdogs. We will keep fighting no matter what. And that we element is important. So the next point, solidarity. Our pride, our defiance, our strength is not just individual. We have each other's backs. We are not alone. And then finally, it's energy. Beyond all the other stuff, it's like, let's go. Like, let's that like jock jam energy, the like battle cry energy, the speech before the march that gets people kind of mentally and spiritually ready for what's about to happen. So anthemic writing could be somewhere in the diagram. It may not be exactly in the center of all four bubbles. It might pull from one or two or three of them in different ways. And while the examples I shared earlier were poems, like we can also see how the anthemic energy plays out in music, right? The examples that pop into my head are like Break My Soul by Beyonce. You won't break my soul. And that kind of like defiance. Pink Pony Club by Chappell Roan. Like, I'm going to keep on dancing. Again, there's some kind of defiance there. Like, you know, like it's telling that Kendrick Lamar's song Not Like Us is they're not like us. It's not saying you're not like me, right? There's a kind of collective energy in that. It's like setting up like we're over here and we have our pride and our defiance. I also think about like, again, this is my own like taste coming through, but like Microcosmos by BTS or La Mudanza by Bad Bunny. It's a lesser known song, but I think one of the best examples of the anthemic impulse in music is Palante by Hooray for the Riff Raff. I'll link to all this stuff in the resource document. But from there, like, let's zoom in even further. So we're talking about poetry mostly, but again, this relates to all kinds of writing. But let's look at 5 maybe more specific elements that to me point toward the anthemic impulse. Number 1, anthemic writing has a forward momentum, an energy that can inspire, illuminate, help us imagine the world that we want to live in. In the broadest sense possible, you might say that a lot of anthemic writing like tends to be positive, but like that word is so loaded. I think positive isn't necessarily sunshine and lollipops, right? It can still be sharp-edged and angry and world-weary and even cynical. It's just that underneath all of that is this lifting up, the centering of possibility. So from our list, if we look at the Rudy Francisco poem, Rifle or The Heart and the Fist, it's easy to write a poem that says like, the way young men are treated in this country or like are raised to understand masculinity is often very narrow and that narrowness hurts both us and the people around us, right? Like that's a true observation. But in the poem, the repetition of a phrase like, I am learning, and then connected to this kind of extended metaphor of the weapon that is repurposed into a musical instrument, like it gives us something beyond pointing at the bad thing and saying that it's bad. It points to possibility, to forward momentum, to movement. So number 2, on that note, I think anthemic writing isn't just about understanding an issue or offering a critique. It often calls us to action. In some sense, it is mobilizing versus demobilizing. So this little image that I made, right? Like the orcs are attacking and the reality is the reality, however we feel about that. But then there's this question about what we choose to say. Too often in social media or pop culture, like the option is presented as you can either say the orcs are attacking or you can say everything is fine. And like no one is saying that we should say everything is fine. What we're pointing out is the difference between abandon your posts, flee for your lives, and prepare for battle, right? In a more practical, like creative writing sense, it's about the difference between writing, say, we live in a brutal police state and always have, versus we live in a brutal police state and there have always been people who have pushed for a more just and life-affirming world, and we will continue to do that. And then like, depending on the poem, you can even be like, here are 3 examples of people in my neighborhood doing that right now, right? So again, we're not saying don't acknowledge reality. We're saying it's good to acknowledge reality. And it is also good to acknowledge the agency people have to do something about that reality. Not every poem or piece of writing has to do that, but I'd argue that it's worth thinking about. So more qualities of anthemic writing. Number 3, I think about writing that, might be preaching to the choir, to use the oft used phrase, talking to people who like already broadly agree with us, but doing that with power and intentionality. When the goal isn't persuasion, like what other kinds of work can a piece of writing do? What is possible when the choir is mobilized? Or how might we challenge the choir to push their analysis even further? Once again, I reference this poem all the time, but like, Janata's "Can we please give the police department to the grandmothers?" Janata Petrus, like people hearing that poem might already be on board with abolition as a concept, but I would argue that the poem challenges us to consider it as a reality, not just something we post about on the internet or agree with in kind of broad philosophical terms, but as an embodied reality that we can help build right now. Number 4. I think about writing that meets the moment with a specific point of view, rejecting neutrality. It says the thing it wants to say, unapologetically. Because in some literary or cultural or pop cultural spaces, politics is treated as something to be hidden or ashamed of, right? Like your art shouldn't be political. And if it is, you have to be subtle. You have to sneak it in like when you hide the dog's medicine in a treat, right? So in that same interview with Tony K. Bambara, with the oft quoted like "make revolution irresistible" formulation, like she also talks about how the artwork or the art practice that sells a capitalist ideology is considered art, and anything that deviates from that is considered political propagandist, polemical, or didactic, strange, weird, subversive, or ugly, unquote. And my favorite anthemic art embraces all that, right? So if we look at our list again, poems like "Dinosaurs in the Hood" by Denez Smith, or "Queer Youth Are 5 Times More Likely to Die by Suicide" by Andrea Gibson. Like these kinds of poems are bold and straightforward. They're not about struggle in like a big, broad, abstract philosophical sense. They are making specific points with specific audiences in mind. And there's still good poetry in them, but like they're also doing this direct thing. We'll explore more of this in the next video. But then again, number 5, talking about kind of elements in anthemic writing. And we touched on this earlier, but I think anthemic writing is very often about collective power, not just individual achievement. And whether that is explicit or implicit, there is often this turn from I to we in that kind of writing. And sometimes it's in the writing. So like "The Low Road" by Marge Piercy, like it's written in the second person, but it's all about collective power, like in the substance of it. But then sometimes it's also a product of context. If we step outside of poetry for a moment, I think a lot about songs. And songs that like were incredible just on their own as pieces of art or media, but then when you put them in the context of their historical moment, they take on more meaning. So songs like "I Will Survive," or "Stand By Me," or "Fortunate Son," or "Respect." And maybe all these songs are on the page written in the first person, but I hear them with this anthemic impulse toward the collective, whether that's intentional or not, just because of the circumstances around them. Like circumstances give meaning to our words as much as we do. Another way of thinking about this point, just really quick, like the focus in a lot of anthemic writing is on us, the collective we. And this is in contrast to, one, a lot of poems are like I, me. And that's probably easy to picture. Like, here's what I think, here's how I feel. The less generous framing of that is that a lot of poetry in general is like navel gazing. It's focused on the self and never moves beyond that. The more generous version is that the individual experience is often the doorway into something more collective, or can be. And then the second point here, a lot of poems, and honestly, like discourse and communication in general, are you, right? Like, you need to rethink this. You are wrong. Like, how could you ever think that? Like, your assumptions are bad. Like, and there are powerful poems that can operate from that space. But part of the anthemic impulse for me is that we don't separate ourselves from the people, from the collective we. If we're judging or critiquing, we are also judging or critiquing ourselves, not just pointing fingers. If I'm writing about extreme wealth, for example, there is a difference between me saying, all you people out there are so greedy and selfish, Or maybe telling a story about a time where I felt some kind of greed or selfishness, or just my own complicity in a larger system, and how I navigated it, and how that transitions then into a more kind of we-centered understanding of abundance and value and how we relate to one another. Or maybe if I am critiquing and pointing a finger at someone, it's someone specific. It's like I'm saying, Elon Musk, you're a bad person. But then the poem is also about what are we going to do about that, this larger collective impulse. Lots to mess around with there. We've been talking about, again, these different elements of what anthemic writing can possibly look like or can possibly incorporate it. I want to just pause for a second and affirm a couple of notes. One, I want to affirm that the anthemic impulse is not the only way to meet the moment or tackle political issues. This is not about telling anyone else how they should write. I think we need cynical poems and anthemic poems, angry poems and hopeful poems, and angry, hopeful poems, right? We need elegies and we need calls to action. Like, this is about exploring one angle, one tactic, one potential approach. Related to that, anthemic writing is not inherently more or less valuable than writing that critiques or describes reality as it is or expresses doubt, or the phrase that I use all the time, points at the bad thing and says that it's bad, right? But anthemic writing can do this other kind of work that I think is worth doing if you want to do it. Right? I believe that art that mobilizes people, that invites people into movement, that helps us see what we're fighting for is valuable. Right? If the dominant narrative of this moment is overwhelm and powerlessness and despair, anthemic writing can be one way to meet the moment by presenting a counter narrative of solidarity and agency and hope. One more thought here before we keep going. I think this is an important one, but what qualifies as anthemic? Like, we can share all these variables and all these characteristics, but what qualifies as anthemic is going to vary according to taste, according to audience, according to context. An obvious point that is maybe a hard pill for some of us to swallow sometimes is this is all subjective. What is super inspirational or life-changing to one person might be to someone else cringy or preachy or performative or corny, right? And on the flip side, like, no matter how powerful or anthemic a piece of writing is, like, someone out there is gonna criticize it for being preachy or didactic or propagandistic, often just because they disagree with it, or because they're insecure for whatever reason, or maybe it is kind of preachy or didactic, or maybe they just have a different taste, right? That being said, it isn't a simple thing, but I think we can still explore the concept. If we think about cringy and anthemic as opposite ends of the spectrum, like, how do we move further from one and closer to the other? We will explore that in the second half of this conversation in the next video, when we zoom in, not just on these like elements of anthemic writing, but specific tactics and techniques that we can use if we're interested in this. Before that, let's do some writing. So I have a very, very simple, as you may have noticed, a lot of my writing prompts tend to be pretty straightforward and simple because that's what I like. This is a very simple prompt. It's just, imagine that you are asked to perform a poem at a rally about an issue that you care about. You have 2 minutes. You'll be up in front of like 10,000 people who are there because they already believe in your cause. So what do you say? This is another prompt where it isn't really about a specific writing exercise. Like, I'm not telling you what to write. I'm asking you to imagine a situation, a potential place where your writing might live. It's a prompt that is so simple on one hand, but so many of us who are already poets or creative people, I think we're so often in our own heads about like, what's going to get me a high score at the poetry slam, or what's going to get me published in my favorite literary magazine, or what's going to do numbers on social media, or what will push boundaries and make me stand out as creative and smart and impress all my arty friends, right? Artsy poet friends, artsy art people friends, whatever. And then this question of what will work at a march or rally is just a fundamentally different way of approaching the topics that we care about. One reason I'm grateful for my spoken word community and mentors and peers is I feel like I was able to learn in ways I did not learn in the classroom most of the time how and why context matters, right? And yes, craft matters too. And our pure kind of honest expression can matter too. But I'm sharing this prompt here kind of just as yet another way to communicate what I mean by the term anthemic. What do you share when you are standing up in front of 1,000 people or 10,000 people who agree with you? What kind of work can you still do in that space? How does your understanding of what makes a poem good or bad maybe shift in that context? What makes a poem work in that context? So the prompt is just a doorway, right? You can go with your first instinct, what feels right to you. In the next video, we will zoom in on some, specific techniques and tools for writing in an anthemic way, stuff that may be useful to like revise or sharpen whatever you come up with right here. So yeah, thank you.